I grew up in a time of transition in the Catholic Church. There were still altar railings in my home parish, but there was a new Vatican II interest in involving the community of faith. And while my childhood impressions of church were positive, in retrospect, I think my formative years could have been described as a time in between. It was more of a caught faith than a taught faith, which could leave me feeling sophomoric in my exposure to Scripture or lack of experience with many of the long-held traditions and rituals of the Church that many speak fondly of. For much of my childhood and adult young life, attending church was more of a rote obligation than a living encounter with God. As I grew, I often felt the appeal of having a personal relationship with the understanding and unconditional love of God, but I had yet to find a compelling reason to put God's ways above my own. In college, I began attending the Newman Center and feel that was my real confirmation. I'd made the choice to continue my faith life on my own and for myself. It was no longer just a matter of obligation. I wanted to go to Mass and began to notice that a desire for a relationship with God was growing within me. I continued to put myself in a pew throughout my early adulthood, though there was a spiritual loneliness during that time. I was no longer attending Mass with my childhood family, and my husband wasn't Catholic when we were married or in our first years of parenthood. I was there, and I was listening, but there wasn't the fullness I later came to know through experiencing God with and through others. It was my husband Sean's conversion process through the RCIA program here at St. Margaret Mary that eventually opened a door for us to feel and understand what it means to belong to a parish family. God began to reveal himself to us through the faith and kindness of others, which would be a critical component of our encounter with God in the years ahead. We faced our first personal, marital, and spiritual crisis when our second child, Patrick, was diagnosed with a life-threatening liver disease at 6 months of age. We endured long hospitalizations, numerous medical procedures, and a lengthy undiagnosed illness. But in between those trying times, we lived a life filled with joy. Yet we were still approaching life from the driver's seat. God was a welcomed companion, but we weren't placing every aspect of our life in his hands. That all changed when we lost our son to cancer just a few years later. Everything we'd conceived of bled out with that loss, and we were forced to realize that we were really never in control of life's circumstances. We were left in a darkness we had no way of navigating on our own, and it seemed we would never fully breathe, much less fully live again. In the first years after Patrick's death, there were many times I came dangerously close to giving in to the temptation of despair. Desolation was only too happy to watch me wither and wallow in my blinding pain. Repeatedly, I had to make a conscious decision to fight that temptation and to turn to God in my darkest hours, begging for help and healing. It was then that I turned to our parish family, and God used this community of faith to make himself known in my life. When I attended the Christ Renews His Parish retreat over a decade ago, I was totally and completely lost, and I knew that without God's help, I couldn't go on. I was losing hope, and I didn't know how I could continue to bear the pain in my soul. I'd reached the point of complete surrender. And in that period of encompassing vulnerability, my relationship with God was transformed from philosophical to personal. In that deep pit of grief, I experienced God's profound love. I consciously became God's daughter, and was certain that he was right down in the middle of my sorrow, weeping with me and holding me close. God gently reached out to me in a tangible way that weekend. He connected me to the faith, conviction, compassion, and support of an incredible handful of women who would so significantly strengthen my faith. He planted the seeds of an incredible spiritual relationship, and he created an environment in which I felt safe enough to share my pain, wrapping me with the positive, faithful, healing energy of these women. God worked through them to help me begin once again to believe in hope. Jesus has become my friend, my companion, not some distant historical figure, but a brother who understands the struggles and sufferings of life. And as I have accepted God's infinite and compassionate love for me through others, I can't help but wish to reflect that love to the world. I once heard Father Richard Rohr say that it is in these moments of difficulty or doubt or suffering that our soul expands. Looking back, that is what has happened to me. My life was broken wide open, and God used this to transform me. There was a time not too long ago that I thought everything would be about what had been, rather than what is. I thought all things would be measured by what I used to have. Yet my pain has been replaced with peace, and my soul has been filled with the love of God. I have been renewed with a sense of joy and rebirth. I have lived some part of my own personal resurrection story through my encounter with God. I have known the darkness of loss. I have experienced the enemy vying for my wounded soul. I have felt the faithful companionship of my parish family as I carried this cross, and I have rejoiced as God began a new life in me, a life that belongs wholeheartedly to Him.